Welcome everyone to Marijuana Justice. It's Marijuana Monthlies. We are really excited to be here. We're just going to wait about a minute or two and let some folks in the room. We've got some great conversation about to happen today. And per usual, we are also streaming live on Facebook right now. And you will be able to access this video and conversation on our YouTube page as well. So make sure that you are subscribed to marijuanajustice.org. We'll be sending it out in our emails, as well as you can find our stuff on our social media at THC Justice Now. So if you are not following on all of the social media, which is Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for us right now, make sure you are. And that way you don't miss any of these conversations. Again, my name is Chelsea Higgs-Wise, and I'm the Executive Director of Marijuana Justice. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of get us started with the conversation and let you know that every month we meet in this Zoom space, the first Wednesday of the month at 6:30. This is the time where we really go over what's happening in Virginia, and we invite other speakers in to have different conversations, to cover conversations about legalization in Virginia, find out what's happening around the nation and what we need to be talking about in the Commonwealth. And today's conversation is what is focused about social equity, like what is at stake for our social equity, particularly around starting up our cannabis commercial industry. Now, before we talk about that, let's just have a quick update and a quick rundown about Virginia legalization process. So Marijuana Justice is part of a Legalize It Right coalition that was formed 2 years ago. And it includes us, Marijuana Justice, Rise for Youth, Justice Forward, and Virginia Student Power Network. So in 2020, we fought to repeal the prohibition that would make possession legal. But because many of the leaders in the state just last year were not settled with that fight, they did decide to go with decrim, a process that was filled with penalties. And so in 2020, we supported a study that really focused on a more equitable process that we got passed. So that's what we were really championing in 2020. And we were so thankful for that, because in 2021, just this past January, we had to use that study to really push for an equitable legalization bill. No one could have expected the uprising in 2020, and no one could have expected the demands of cannabis legalization like they were coming in 2021 after the uprising and the global pandemic, as well as just the conversation about what has to be done right now for Black lives. And we cannot talk about cannabis. We cannot not talk about the war on drugs when we're talking about 2020 and what has to happen right now. So in 2021, we came in and we were actually able to meet our 2-year campaign goal, which is to repeal the prohibition of simple possession. So as of July 1, you are able to possess up to 1 ounce of marijuana. And that is what we did. We legalized possession. So I want to stop there for 1 second and say that's what happened July 1. Now, there's a big conversation about Virginia legalizing marijuana, but what people don't know and maybe don't realize is that we have to come back in 2022 and finish this bill and finish this process, right? Only thing we did was talk about possession. We did not talk about resentencing. There are many people still incarcerated and behind bars in cages for marijuana-related crimes. And we did not talk anything about firming up our social equity. We still do not have definitions for our social equity areas and our disproportionately impacted areas of policing. So there's much that we still have to do to say that we have legalized it right here in Virginia. So as we work towards going towards 2022, and up until this 2022 General Assembly, you may be asking what's going on, right? So what's actually happening right now is that the legislators have assembled a joint commission of cannabis oversight, as the Cannabis Control Authority has not yet been set up. And so not all the appointees are there, as well as the regulations have to come final from our legislation that I just said we still have to go through the process and get finalized probably through this next session. And so as we're looking at this oversight commission, we're really looking at what they're talking about. And there were 2 major points that we heard that stood out to us from this very first meeting. This very first meeting, we did notice that the chair and the vice chair were elected. The chair is Senator Eben, and the vice chair is Majority Leader Delegate Charneil Herring. This is very appropriate as both were the patrons of the legalization bill and their respective chambers. And so it made sense that they're on this commission as well as leading this commission. So 2 points that really stood out from this first conversation was, number one, are we going to have a new possession crime? I just mentioned we just legalized possession, but are we about to make a possession another crime? So as of right now, you can possess up to an ounce, but anywhere in between an ounce and a pound, it's a civil penalty. It's kind of like a traffic ticket. But at this particular meeting, there is a body called JLARC that is now recommending that maybe we should take some of those civil penalties and make them misdemeanors, which would mean take us back to criminal court. We just repealed the prohibition in July. They're talking about taking us back to criminal court. Now, what I will say is thanks to the reporting from Mel Lenore over at the Richmond Times-Dispatch, she really went hard to interview the chair and the vice chair of this Oversight Commission of Cannabis, who I also mentioned were the patrons of this bill. And the patrons both said that it was very unlikely that this new possession crime would come up next General Assembly. So we're going to just hold them to that and say that we really hope that we're not going to continue to go backwards because there is just too much to do. Now, the other thing that we stood out to us in this commission meeting was that they were talking about speeding up commercial sales. So if you paid attention to the process of legalization this past winter, January through March, you would have actually noticed that Virginia did not want to legalize anything, including possession, until 2024. They wanted to wait 3 years in order to get the industry right. And we weren't objective to that, but we did say you need to stop the harm now, which means stop the police from enforcing these possession crimes. And through showing that the police were doing it by targeting Black people, we were able to do that. But the big part is that they were not going to do it till 2024. So we actually have until 2024 when commercial sales will start here in Virginia. So what does the process look like? What does social equity mean? And now that we're talking about speeding it up before 2024, or maybe even speeding up the application process, what will that mean for social equity applicants? So that's really what we're going to talk about today. There's so much to talk about with legalization. That's why we really meet every month. That's why we work with a coalition of organizers and organizations that have their own expertise. And we're really excited for the speaker tonight that's going to bring their expertise. And before I pass it off to my co-moderator and teammate over at Marijuana Justice, I quickly want to just say that the reason that this particular speaker is here with us today, just to be a bit transparent, is because after watching this commission oversight for cannabis, I was a bit panicked. And I reached out to some of our contacts across the nation, and I really said, who can be a good voice to educate Virginia, bring some points about what's happened across the country, and really talk about what speeding up commercial sales will mean for social equity operators, will mean for the Black and brown people that are now being in this industry and are being told that this is their chance based off of the war on drugs that have always been oppressive and disenfranchising us. So if this is our opportunity, what does this mean? And so when I was reaching out to my contacts, I said, you have to reach out and see about Shailene Title. And I'm, for real, y'all, I slid on right into her DMs and I said, hey, I'm an advocate in Virginia. Can we chat? I sent her some articles and she and I were on the phone in just a matter of days. So I'm really thankful for this conversation and learning from her, learning from other folks. So we hope that you've come with some questions and just remembering that we still have to firm all of this up in 2022. So what you're hearing, what's in our bill right now is not final. And that's why we're so excited to have the speaker here and think about the opportunities for Virginia. So up next, I'm going to just invite Sasha on up, introduce herself really quickly, bring the speaker on, and I'll let you take it from here. Sasha.
Thank you, Chelsea. Hi, good evening, everyone. I am Sasha Sproul. I am the policy coordinator with Marijuana Justice Virginia, and I will also be co-moderating this discussion tonight. So I'm really excited to introduce our speaker. Like Chelsea said, it is very divine how we were able to orchestrate her being here tonight because she comes with a lot of expertise and experience in this conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. Our speaker today is Shailene Title. She is an attorney who has been writing, passing, and implementing equitable cannabis laws for over 20 years. She is currently serving as a distinguished cannabis policy fellow at the Ohio State University Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. As CEO of the drug policy think tank Parabola Center, she co-authored 2021 model federal amendments focusing on protecting people rather than corporate profits. She was appointed to oversee the initial development and implementation of legalizing marijuana in Massachusetts from 2017 through 2020. So welcome, Shailene. Thank you for joining us today. We're so excited to deep dive into your background and your expertise. I'm going to start off by giving you the floor to share more of your background and your work experience with drug policy.
Great. Thank you so much, Sasha. I'm really glad to be here. You were definitely on my radar. I think I first heard of you because I was interviewed for that study. And I was being asked like really good, thorough questions. And I was wondering like, how is this coming about that, you know, someone is preparing so well, and kind of looked into where the idea for the study came from. And then you've been on my radar since, and I really think that so far, what I've seen and what I've seen tonight, you're very much a model for a strong coalition that can get through what in many ways is the hardest part when legalization starts. And I've now been through that a few times. So I'll go through my background and then we can kind of talk about like whatever parts are relevant in this moment. So I started about 20 years ago, and at that time, there was no profit motive in legalization. It was kind of the opposite. Like you would be advised not to work on drug policy. People would say, take it off of your resume. And you would have to do it because you love it. Like that was the only reason. And, you know, it was a really good way for younger people, students, people of color to get really involved. It was still is, I think, a really diverse movement. And especially when medical marijuana started going, you know, in the late 90s, things started moving really fast. And so I was just often in the right place at the right time. And I worked on throughout law school, I worked on a lot of these measures. And then I worked on the first legalization bill in Colorado in 2012. And then we started to see, you know, that the economic impact of it was not fair. And it was really benefiting rich, white, the same people that control everything. And so I came back here to Massachusetts and worked on the first state level legislation to try to address that. And we learned a lot in that process. And then I was appointed for the past 3 years to oversee the implementation in Massachusetts. And so currently my focus is trying to make sure that those lessons that we learned are really being, we're really talking about them honestly, and we're learning from them around the country so that each state can do better than the last. I have a very good feeling about New York. I think New York is such great legislation. We just saw today. I think they made great picks for the regulators. And so I want to help do that in every single state. So thanks a lot for having me here.
Thank you for sharing that with us. We also pay close attention to New York as well and are constantly in contact with them asking for their advice. So it's really interesting that you brought them up because they're a model for us also. So I'm going to start asking you questions about to dive further into your work experience. So we really appreciate you sharing with us, and what led you to drug policy before you actually joined in the movement?
You know, I was just kind of interested in a lot of different issues, but with drug policy, it felt particularly effective and organized. I found in a lot of other issues that I worked on, it didn't feel like it had such a clear direction. And in particular, I think that there was, especially in the early days, there was a lot of really good coalitions between people that I don't agree on anything, you know, libertarians and Republicans and all of these different groups, but they work together to get legalization passed. And now, you know, as time goes on, I think that as we're getting more evidence, we have to be a lot more specific and prescriptive and responsive to what we're seeing across the country. So that's getting harder, but it's important to keep that same spirit of being in coalitions with people that you might disagree with on other issues.
Yeah, that comes up very often. And in your opinion, what does an equitable fair market look like? And what have you seen well in other states? I know you mentioned New York for an example. So what else have you noticed that hasn't worked in other states?
So my vision in my head, I have not seen it implemented yet, and that would be small businesses, Black-owned businesses, businesses owned by people with drug convictions, and consumers being treated with respect. In particular, I would really like to see the way that alcohol use is ingrained, in our culture. I think you should be able to use marijuana at massage places and art galleries and theaters. And I think we're headed that way, but it's a slow slog. So as for what's working right now, I think that, I know that there is no state or city that has said, that they've accomplished their equity goals. But anecdotally, there's little pieces that are working here and there. And I keep mentioning New York because I think that, what they have on paper is the most promising of what I see. But what's on paper, right? You never know how that's going to turn out. And we've seen that over and over. I think Oakland is a really notable model because they have a very comprehensive set of benefits for their equity program participants. Okay. So that looks like a combination of technical assistance, access to capital, wraparound services like legal and accounting services, access to property, and then combining those with actual benefits in the licensing process. So like fee waivers. And then in many places, including Oakland, there are a number or a percentage of licenses that are set aside for social equity or other people in these programs. But the sequencing is really, really important. So if you put aside half of the licenses, and I'll just go back to New York, half of the licenses are supposed to be put aside for equity applicants. If you let the other 50% go first and you're waiting around for years, and this is something that we've seen in so many states, you really undermine the point. And so I think it's a combination of like your actual equity program and legislation, but then also learning from how we've seen it go wrong in the past.
Yes, I agree. And we are going to get into states speeding up commercial sales and forgetting small businesses in the following question. But I do also, while we're talking about things that worked well, are there any good models for micro businesses and co-ops that you've seen?
It's a great question. Not in practice yet, but there is a really good bill in Rhode Island, I think, that includes worker-owned cooperatives. And I think it's really, really important to talk about cooperatives in particular because so many of these designations are just making more, millionaires who are just a few, who happen to come from a particular community. And when you have a few more women millionaires, it's not really transformative change. But when you have worker-owned cooperatives, it is, and possibly micro businesses as well. So I'm glad you asked that question because we don't want to just refer to all of them, as though they're the same.
Yeah. And have you recently heard of the way New Jersey is going to be doing their micro businesses and like the model that they just written? And if so, what are your thoughts about that model?
Yeah, so what I love about New Jersey is the fact that they took the most difficult barriers in the process that are the most systemic barriers for people who are not independently wealthy. So particularly the documentation of capital, the documentation of property, and the local municipal approval. Those are all things that you need to run a business. So you have to get them eventually, but when you ask for them up front, it really excludes a lot of people, or over time, the applicants run out of capital because they're paying rent, for example, on a property. And so they move their application around. I think it's called conditional permitting, so that the first stage, you don't need to cross any of those barriers. And then you get a formal recognition, a conditional permit from New Jersey, and then you can get those more difficult things. And hopefully it'll help you raise money and find property as well.
And do you think that's going to be very helpful for small businesses of colors to succeed in the New Jersey model?
I do. Yeah. I think stuff like that, where you're just promoting fair and open competition, is really good to begin with. But it's kind of a two-step process. Like, that's step one. And then step two is like the additional benefits for Black-owned businesses, for example.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads to the conversation that we're going to have about Virginia. Chelsea mentioned it earlier in her introduction that there's been talks about speeding up commercial sales in Virginia, specifically to give an advantage to the medicinal industry. So are you familiar with what has been proposed in Virginia to speed up commercial sales? Is there a risk to the social equity process with this urgency that also appears to benefit the medical industry?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with it. I think it's really bad policy. I think it's really brazen, and I think it's really inappropriate and kind of needs to be shut down really swiftly and immediately, because I'm seeing this come up across the country. And in many ways, it feels like a test of what people can get away with, and you don't want to lose that test. So definitely important to shut that down immediately. But I do want to take a step back and say, for context, that I don't paint all medical operators with one brush, and there are often times when the whole industry will need to be together in one coalition. So I always try to, preserve that, but also just be very transparent that the goal here is equity. And if you are suggesting something that specifically undermines equity, we're not going to support you. And the reason why that's the case here is because we have seen all over the country, even in places that have very good proposals on paper, and I would give you Massachusetts, Illinois, and Los Angeles as examples, when the sequencing benefits the medical operators first, you really lose your chance at equity. It becomes much, much more difficult. And the way that it happened in those three jurisdictions was different. The three programs are different, but what was consistent is when you initially had benefits for those medical operators, they ended up way better off. And I think many of them have seen that and are now putting really significant resources and efforts into lobbying for those benefits. Whether it's speeding up sales, whether it's what I saw recently in North Carolina, where they put into a bill a made up barrier of 5 years of experience. Specifically, it was clear from reading it to exclude new entrants from the industry, which is not legal, by the way. So that was taken out of the bill. And then I've seen in Delaware recently, something pretty fair, level playing field for everybody, was referred to in testimony as economic violence against the medical operators. And you're seeing each month it's something new. And I think that here, the idea of only allowing medical operators an exemption to the law 3 years early is going to entrench an oligopoly. And you will never be able to recover from that, no matter what you do for social equity applicants. And we've seen that with evidence throughout the country. So it's very important, I think, to shut that down now and to make clear that if you are going to really support social equity in the way that you're saying, that means not letting other corporations dominate the market first.
Absolutely. And you make a good point. It's the unfair advantage, a 3-year advantage that they would have over small independent retailers. So outside of that 3-year advantage, can you name any other specific things that makes Virginia policy bad?
I'm not familiar enough to say. So if you want my opinion on anything, I'll tell you. But I will say, I actually thought the 3 years was really good policy. And people get mad when I say this because they want the stores to open quickly, and I understand that. But it really is a trade-off, because regulators have to act as everything. When it's federally illegal, you have to start your own agency, you have to be the FDA, you have to be the FTC, you have to be all of these things at the same time. And the easiest path of least resistance is to just let the medical operators, or the most well-resourced operators that can do most of the work themselves, to just let them go. That's the speedy thing. And so if you want to be fair, you have to have some patience. And I think saying we're going to allow possession, and and stop those arrests and give ourselves 3 years to do this right, to me, it made a lot of sense as a regulator.
Okay. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this part of the bill, that within the medical industry, that they would be incubators for 5 to 6 small businesses. So when it was proposed, it was said that it was to be helpful for Black cannabis businesses to give an advantage. Do you agree that do you think, in your opinion, that this would be an advantage that you could consider reparations, or would more of an advantage need to happen for that to be considered reparations for communities impacted, small businesses impacted by the marijuana prohibition?
I would give that a no. The way that I read that is as mitigation to what is a clear oligopoly and an unfair advantage, and not one that's been proven in any way to be effective. If someone out there has an example of an incubator program that's been transformative, let me know, and I will correct myself. But all the ones that I've seen are more or less window dressing, and in many ways an attempt to co-opt the idea of social equity and the idea of centering justice for the harmed communities, because we're not looking for little scraps or some like kiddie table, you know, for whatever the word would be, people being incubated on the side. We're looking for them to be the center and first.
Exactly. And that is where the true social equity comes in. So do you have any recommendations for social equity definitions for states?
I don't think there's a universal definition. I think it really depends on your state. I think in a lot of places, farmers have really been disproportionately harmed, you know, and in other places, it's completely different communities. Also, we've seen courts strike down race-based quotas. And that's pretty narrow. That doesn't mean that you can't discuss race at all. So like in Massachusetts, I think our provisions are great. We include race as one of many criteria that you can meet. But in Ohio, it was 15% of licenses go to minorities specifically, and that was struck down. So you have to be careful about that. You also have to be careful about residency requirements, because those have been struck down recently. What I think is pretty safe myself is directly using people's records if they've been convicted, and you can point to the harm, you know, by definition that it's done to their life, and you know you're now including a population that has a disparity, you know, that you're trying to reach. To me, that makes sense, but there's no one size fits all.
Okay, good point. What would your message be to residents of Virginia who care about social equity and cannabis and the equitable commercial market?
I think really great start from what I've seen. I think letting your group lead makes a lot of sense from what I've seen. And I think that you have to keep your guard up after legalization, because that's when a lot of threats will come into play. And that's where a lot of divide and conquer efforts will come into play. And that's where a lot of movements splinter, because people will apply for something or they'll get a job somewhere and their opinions will change. And that's something that you should anticipate and expect. So I consider myself as a part of like a dozen different coalitions, you know, and one of them is just me, because no one's going to agree with me on everything. And one of them is the entire industry. And then we have all of the other coalitions in between. And I think if you're upfront about that and you consider what you bring to the table to be, it can't be money, right? You're not, I mean, perhaps it is, and then you don't need to listen to my advice. But if you can't compete with money for lobbying, what you can compete with is credibility, a reputation, a platform, influence. All of those things can be built with a coalition and made bigger. And you should document them. You should take credit for your accomplishments. So I love the way that I've seen you take credit for that report. You shouldn't be shy about that, because that builds up your value, and then you can use that value when people try and challenge equity. And then the last thing I would say is just that in Massachusetts, I saw a lot of, I would say, bridge burning, where people would say, like, I'm done with this law. I no longer support it, you know, and I no longer support the commission. The thing is, like, there are times when that's necessary to burn a bridge, but once you've done it, you're done. Like, you've lost all of your power. You've spent all of your power. So I would just encourage people to think really hard, you know, before they oppose a bill. And if you're not at that point, a better thing to do is to try to mitigate it and offer options and offer like an off ramp, you know, to the regulator or whoever disagrees with you.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer to that question. Can you share with us the state of national cannabis equity breakdown and describe your work there?
Sure. And Parabola Center actually released feedback today on federal legislation. So you can find that on our website, parabolacenter.com. I think there's two things that are happening. So one is this is definitely being fought at the state level in a way that is going to influence the national market for generations to come. And I told you people get mad when I say to be patient. So I'll just say again, like, really think about if you can give regulators, you know, 6 months or a year to do something, the fact that our children's children, you know, are going to be impacted by that. In the same way that alcohol prohibition has in many ways stayed exactly the same then as, you know, 100 years ago when it was first crafted. So with that in mind, at the national level, we need to look at the state markets and the federal legislation. And I'll just very briefly say that our overall thesis of federal legislation, which I think is something that's very much being missed by the public and by the cannabis equity community, is that if federal legalization happens all at once, I think we are very likely to have a disruption to the market that is so severe that we won't even be able to recognize it, you know, in a year. And we have Amazon, Big Tobacco, and other large interests that are currently not particularly involved in marijuana that are openly saying and openly lobbying to get involved on the federal level after legalization. And so what we think is we need a gradual transition. And we also need to make sure that we are not preserving oligopolies at the state level while we make that gradual transition. So all the mechanics and specifics are on our website, but I encourage people to make sure that they're aware of what's happening at the federal level as well.
Yeah, that's definitely something that is helpful seeing, because I know for Virginia, we're the only group in the South that is legalizing marijuana is Virginia. So I too would love to see how this kind of spreads all over the country. And I do think, you know, having the start here in Virginia, we would definitely be able to kind of model for other Southern states. So at the same way that a lot of the Northern and Western states have modeled for us. So that will be really fascinating to see how this carries on. And I also want to give the audience a question to ask questions in the chat that we will be answering once our the discussion portion is up. So you can start asking your questions now, and we will open up the floor soon to go over those. I do want to ask you, Shalene, how can people support your work? You have been doing a lot. Like you said, your work experience is 20 years long in drug policy, and you're still pushing forward and still getting a lot of work done. So we want to give a moment for you to express to our attendees how they can support your work and also be in tune and informed about the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I really appreciate you asking that. And in the spirit of telling people to take credit, I think that I've been able to really be a part of a discussion or be at the table or whatever you want to call it, where the other people at that table are typically lobbyists representing corporations. And I don't take money from MSOs, period. So I have a Patreon. It's at parabolacenter.com. If people want to support that way, I would very much appreciate it. But if not, just follow online. And really, like, the work that we're putting out there is for people to read and then revise however you want. So take it, with or without credit, adapt it to what you want to see, because that's the whole purpose of the think tank model language and summaries that we're putting out.
Thank you so much for sharing that. The link is now in the chat, so you can definitely click on the link to support Shalene further. And also, Shalene, is there anything else that you want to add to the conversation, maybe that didn't come up during the conversation?
I just want to reemphasize the divide and conquer thing, just because I've seen it so many times. And I think if you're ready for it, and you kind of like have a plan, you can save yourself a lot of headache, and you can keep your coalition really strong.
Thank you. And I also want to say and second what you mentioned earlier about being able to take credit for your work. I will also say that I see that very often, sometimes even within our own organization. I tell Chelsea all the time, like, you have done a lot of work and you are really responsible for a lot of the decrim bill that was passed. Like, this is your work. And I often get on her about taking credit for it. So I hope she's hearing you. And I hope as we move further that that's something that we get more comfortable with, especially as women, being, like you said, being in this industry. There's a lot of different factors that kind of create this glass ceiling for us. And I just hope we are at that space where we can kind of break through that, because this is breakthrough work. We're doing, work that has not been done before. And I'm very honored that we have the opportunity to learn from you and other people who have joined our conversations and just kind of been leading the way. Thank you for returning, back to us and showing us ways that, because we do need that. So we are really appreciative for you being here today. I'm going to check to see if there are any questions. We have some shout outs in the chat to Chelsea. I just want to give her flowers as well. Thank you, Chelsea, for all the work that you do for the community.
Yeah, I think as important as taking credit is lifting each other up as well. I mean, that's universally applicable, but I think here especially, we have, like Chelsea said in the intro, we have so much more power since the uprising in 2020. And so every time there's a legalization bill that's passing, you don't have a politician now who can talk about it without mentioning these specifics, right? And so if you're able to then share, like, the person who's doing the work in that state or in another state that you could model off of, or, if you're in the South and you're saying Virginia is the model for the South, we should all be echoing each other that way and building each other's power.
Agreed. And are there any other states that we should be watching at this very moment?
I think New York and New Jersey are really important because I consider them kind of the next generation after the first states to try equity. They really implemented the earlier lessons. And then I think just making sure we read the bills, because what happened in North Carolina was so crazy to me. Like, I can't believe that they are so ridiculous to me. I couldn't believe that they could try that kind of brazenly illegal proposal. And I think as soon as it was pointed out, they were like, oh, never mind, and took it out. Like, they almost put it in knowingly, I felt. So I think in every state, we should all be reading through the bills and pointing things out.
Good points. And what, something from your background, you are a lawyer. So we also are curious, what unique needs can a lawyer provide to help them move the needle in Virginia towards the equitable industry?
Oh, that's a great question. And that completely matches what I was just saying, which is just reading, just being that policy person who reads and translates is so important. And they pay armies of lawyers and lobbyists at big corporations to read these bills. And I've read the summary, and very, very often the summary that's coming from activists who read it is better. And I'm seeing in the chat that Chelsea said you don't need to be a lawyer. That's so true. Some of the most effective activists in Massachusetts who have been responsible for very significant policy changes were just people who read the regulations, did a Facebook video, summarized it, and then gave some advice about how to testify at a hearing, how to be polite, how to be specific, how to be concrete, and came up together as a group with 2 or 3 things that they wanted to change. And then at the hearing, everybody in their own words said why they supported those 2 or 3 things, and then the agency changed it.
Oh, wow. Another question in the chat is, what can we do to ensure funding is adequate through VA and New York's adult use program?
That's a very tricky question. It comes down to accountability. And I'm not familiar enough to know if it's going to be the same agencies that regulate cannabis that will be watching the funding. But I would go through either way the auditor. I would make sure that you're asking the auditor where the tax revenue is going. And I think that public transparency on the funding is really important. I think public pressure makes a difference. Probably the most like viral online moment I ever had was last year when they tried to put Massachusetts tax revenue from cannabis to police training. And it was the same kind of thing where someone was just reading it and just happened to catch it, and there was a massive uproar, and then they decided not to. But if no one would have caught it, they would have done it. So I think it's just a matter of asking for it, really. And then I wanted to go back to the lawyer thing really quickly. I forgot to mention providing legal services to small businesses is such a wonderful thing that you can do. Really small things like, not really small, but like really ordinary things like formation, incorporation. And then if you learn about that, as even if you're like a young or a lawyer without much experience, you will be at the same level as someone who's been practicing law for 40 years because you're both learning the same regulations at the same time.
Very true, very true. And we are learning that as a coalition ourselves, how valuable lawyers are in this framework as we're building legislation, even very crucial in our work. So that is a very good point. And our last question for the evening from the audience is, can you please share your thoughts on the 100% residency requirement for micro businesses in New Jersey? Will it be stricken down as it has been in other states? Or do you think it will be stricken down as it has been in other states?
I'm going to sort of cop out the answer to that question because I haven't read all of the cases, but I am going to be doing a webinar with Parabola Center on this exact topic. I can tell you it's not going to be a yes or no answer, but we'll probably do at least an hour going through the cases and then explaining how you can be how you can lower your risk as much as possible. And a lot of us who are regulators are in touch about these things. So I'm sure I'll be talking to the New Jersey regulators as well. But bottom line is they're probably not going to put anything in regulation that is very likely to be struck down. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you so much. That concludes the question portion of the discussion. And I also want to thank you for your time and coming here today and providing so much insight and expertise. This conversation is invaluable, and I found it very helpful and informative. And I hope our audience at home found it to be helpful and informative as the same as I did. I'm sure that they have. So that does conclude our conversation for tonight. Again, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to close this with talking to our attendees. Please don't forget to follow us on social medias at THC Justice Now. That's Instagram and Twitter. You can click the link in our bio and our link tree, and you can learn where to donate for Marijuana Justice Virginia. And don't forget to subscribe to marijuanajusticevirginia.org. And following this conversation, you can also go in and register for next month's Marijuana Monthlies. We do this every Wednesday, the first Wednesday of the month. So thank you all for being here. And that concludes our conversation. Thank you, Shalene, so much. We really, really appreciate you being here tonight.
I find you inspiring. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, everyone.